The train screeched into Dustwood Station, its wheels shrieking against the rusted rails. A plume of smoke drifted upward, settling into the gray sky as if the heavens themselves refused to clear above this forgotten town. Thomas Hale stepped off the carriage with his battered leather case, adjusting his fedora against the biting wind. He had been in plenty of small towns before. He was a journalist after all, but there was something unnerving in the silence that greeted him here. Dustwood was not a town that welcomed strangers. The streets were lined with old brick storefronts, most of them empty. Their windows, smeared with dust, reflected little more than shadows of a town that had once thrived on coal. At the edge of the horizon, the black mouth of the old mine loomed, boarded shut yet impossible to ignore. It sat on the hillside like a scar carved into the earth, a silent reminder of both the town's fortune and its tragedy. Thomas wasn't here for nostalgia. He was here because people were disappearing. It had started, according to the telegram he received, with a boy of 12 who never returned from running an errand. Then a young woman vanished on her way home from church. Soon, miners, farmers, and even an old sheriff, all gone. Some left behind half-eaten dinners. Others vanished in broad daylight. The official reports blamed wolves, bandits, or runaways, but Thomas had been a reporter long enough to know when fear was covering something deeper. As he made his way down the station steps, he felt the weight of eyes watching him. Two men leaned against a post outside the general store, whispering in low tones. A woman carrying a basket stopped mid-step when she noticed him, quickly crossing herself before hurrying on. Dustwood was the kind of town where superstition walked hand in hand with daily life, and strangers rarely entered unnoticed. Thomas stopped at the inn, a creaking two-story building with peeling paint and a wooden sign that swung in the wind. The innkeeper, a stout woman with sharp eyes, slid a ledger toward him without a word. "Thomas Hale, reporter from New York," he said, signing his name. Her gaze flicked to his press badge before narrowing. "If you're here about the missing, best you catch the next train out." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Why's that?" "Because Dustwood don't talk. And when strangers start poking around, Dustwood gets mean." She closed the ledger with a snap. "Room upstairs. Last on the left. Supper's at 6. Don't be late." The conversation ended there, and Thomas carried his case upstairs. The room smelled faintly of coal dust and damp wood. From the window, he could see the mine in the distance, its boarded mouth almost glowing under the gray sky. A chill crept through him, but he shook it off. Fear was just another trick of the mind, and he'd learned long ago not to let it dictate his steps. By evening, Thomas was seated in the inn's dining hall, sharing a table with 3 locals who avoided his eyes. The only sound was the clatter of spoons against bowls of stew. Eventually, one of the men muttered under his breath, "Best keep your nose out of where it don't belong, stranger." Thomas smirked, sipping his water. "Lucky for me, my nose pays the bills." That earned him a glare, but no further words. Later that night, unable to shake the tension, Thomas wandered the streets. Lanterns flickered faintly, casting long shadows across cobblestones. That's when he noticed her, Clara, a young woman with auburn hair tucked beneath a bonnet, pacing nervously near the church. She looked up as he approached, her eyes darting as if afraid to be seen. "You're the reporter?" she whispered. Thomas tipped his hat. "Depends who's asking." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "My brother was the first to disappear. They said he ran off, but I know better. He went near the mine. No one goes near there and comes back." Thomas studied her expression. There was no tremble of superstition, only the steady weight of grief. "What do you think happened?" he asked. Clara's eyes darkened. "I think something lives in those tunnels. Something the town's been hiding for years." Before Thomas could press further, a door slammed nearby and Clara stiffened. She backed into the shadows, whispering one last warning. "Be careful. The mine isn't just closed, it's cursed." Thomas watched her disappear into the night, her words echoing in his mind. The chill that had nagged him since his arrival grew sharper. He turned his gaze once more toward the black silhouette on the hill. The mine. It was where the truth began, and where, if Clara was right, the horror still waited. And as the night wind carried the faintest sound of something scratching beneath the earth, Thomas realized Dustwood's secrets weren't going to stay buried for long. Morning in Dustwood didn't bring warmth. The sun struggled behind thick clouds, spilling pale light that did little to push back the gray that clung to the town. Thomas Hale rose early not because he had slept well, he hadn't, but because the silence of the inn pressed on his chest like a weight. He was used to city noise, car horns, shouting vendors, the restless hum of life. Here, silence felt like a warning. He sat in the dining hall with coffee so bitter it scraped his throat. Across the room, a pair of old miners whispered over their breakfast. They kept glancing at him, then lowering their eyes quickly whenever he returned the look. Thomas leaned forward. "Gentlemen," he said smoothly, "I'm writing about Dustwood. I'd like to hear your stories." One of the miners scowled. "Ain't got no stories." "Then maybe you've got answers," Thomas pressed. "About the missing." The second miner shook his head, fear written in the lines of his face. "We don't talk about that. You want answers, you go up to Sheriff Latham." Thomas leaned back, hiding his frustration. Fear ran thicker than blood here. Still, he'd been pointed toward the sheriff, and that was as good a place as any to start. The sheriff's office stood at the edge of Main Street, a squat brick building with iron bars over the windows. Sheriff Latham was a broad man in his 50s, his jaw lined with stubble, his eyes sharp but tired. He listened as Thomas introduced himself, then leaned back in his chair with a sigh. "You reporters are all the same," Latham muttered. "Think you can stroll into town and solve what we can't." "I don't pretend to solve anything," Thomas said evenly. "I just ask questions. You've had at least a dozen people vanish in the past 6 months. That doesn't happen without reason." The sheriff's eyes hardened. "Reason is this is Dustwood. Folks wander off, some drink themselves into trouble, others, well, maybe the wolves got him." Thomas tapped his pen against his notebook. "And the boy who vanished? The one Clara mentioned, her brother?" Latham's jaw tightened at the name. Clara should learn to keep quiet. Her brother was a curious fool. If he went nosing around the mine, that's on him. Place is dangerous. Been closed since 24. Closed, Thomas echoed. Or covered up? The sheriff slammed his hand on the desk. "You're stirring ghosts, Hale. My advice? Leave before this town chews you up like the rest." But Thomas didn't leave. Reporters never did when the smell of a real story was this strong. Instead, he walked through town, letting his questions hang heavy in the air. Each time he asked, the same pattern emerged: lowered voices, darting glances, and silence. The people of Dustwood weren't just afraid of the mine, they were afraid of speaking its name. By afternoon, Thomas found himself back at the church, its wooden steeple casting a long shadow over the square. The priest, Father Alden, stood at the steps, his hands folded tightly around a worn Bible. "You're the reporter," Alden said, his voice thin. "I've prayed you wouldn't come." Thomas raised a brow. "Strange prayer, Father. Most folks welcome someone who's looking for the truth." "The truth," Alden whispered, "is what damned this town. The mine took more than coal from the earth. It woke something that should have stayed buried." Thomas frowned. "Superstition?" The priest's eyes flashed. "Call it what you will. I've seen men return from those tunnels with eyes that no longer belong to them. I've buried families with no bodies to fill the coffins. The ground here is cursed, Mr. Hale. You'll find nothing but ruin if you keep digging." Before Thomas could ask more, Clara appeared, clutching a basket of bread. She shot a nervous glance at the priest before pulling Thomas aside. "You need proof," she whispered urgently. "Meet me tonight after dark. At the hill by the mine. But you must promise not to tell anyone." Thomas studied her face. Fear trembled in her words, but beneath it was something sharper: determination. "I'll be there," he said. That night, as the town slept under a restless wind, Thomas slipped from the inn. The streets were empty, save for a dog that howled at something unseen. He made his way toward the hill, his lantern flickering against the black shape of the mine. Clara was waiting, her face pale in the glow of her lantern. She didn't speak at first, just pointed to a bundle wrapped in cloth at her feet. When Thomas crouched and unwrapped it, his breath caught. Inside lay a shoe, small, worn, and stained dark with something that had long dried. "My brothers," Clara whispered. "They said he ran away, but I found this by the mine. And I swear at night I hear voices down there, screaming, like they're still alive." The mine loomed above them, silent and cold. Thomas held the shoe in his hand, the weight of the truth pressing against him. He had come for a story. Now he realized he had walked straight into something far more dangerous. And as the night deepened, the earth beneath their feet seemed to shudder, just faintly, as if something stirred far below. The mine loomed over Dustwood like a scar. Even in daylight, its black mouth yawned wide, framed by broken beams and rusted rails that disappeared into the dark. By night it was worse, a wound in the earth that whispered with every gust of wind. Thomas had never believed in curses, but standing there with Clara, the shoe still heavy in his hand, he felt something pressing against him. The air was thicker here, heavy with damp stone and coal dust that hadn't seen the light in years. "We can't stay long," Clara whispered. "Someone will see us." Thomas glanced at her, the lantern glow catching the sharpness in her features. "You wanted me here. Why?" She hesitated, then stepped closer to the mine's entrance. "Because I've heard them. At night when the wind dies. Voices. My brother's among them, I know it. And if I can hear them, maybe you can too." The words hung like frost. Thomas wanted to dismiss them, to call it grief twisting her mind, but the shiver in his bones betrayed him. Still, he lifted his lantern and together they stepped closer. Inside, the darkness swallowed everything. Their footsteps echoed against wet stone, and the old timbers creaked overhead like brittle bones. Thomas raised his notebook, scribbling notes even as his hand shook. Then it came. At first, faint, like a breath caught in the walls. Then stronger, layered, impossible. A chorus of voices whispering, echoing in patterns that were not random. Words twisted into cries. "Please." Screams. Thomas froze. The sound was everywhere, yet nowhere at once. Clara clutched his arm, her knuckles white. "Do you hear it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Thomas swallowed. "Yes." The whispers swelled, building into something like a chant. And then, clearer than all the rest, a boy's voice. Fragile. Desperate. "Clara?" She gasped, stumbling forward as if pulled by the sound. Thomas yanked her back just in time as the ground near the tunnel's edge shifted, gravel spilling into a dark shaft that dropped into nothing. The mine groaned, alive, as if it had been waiting for them. Thomas pulled Clara away, their breaths ragged. Outside, the cold air hit them like a wave, but the whispers still clung to their ears, echoing long after they escaped the tunnel's mouth. Clara collapsed to her knees. "You heard him. Tell me you heard him." Thomas hesitated, his instincts warring. Reporters dealt in facts, not phantoms. But there was no denying what he had just heard. "I heard," he said at last. "And if voices are coming from that mine, then your brother may not be the only one down there." A sharp crack split the night. Not from the mine, closer. A rifle being cocked. "Step away from there," a voice barked. Thomas spun. Sheriff Latham stood at the tree line, lantern raised, gun trained on them. His face was hard, but his eyes carried something deeper, fear. "I told you, Hale," Latham growled. "Leave the mine alone. This isn't your story. It's your grave if you keep pushing." The lantern's flame flickered, and for a moment Thomas thought he saw movement in the shadows behind the sheriff. Not human movement, something lower, crawling, watching. But when he blinked, it was gone. The sheriff waved the gun toward town. "Both of you. Now." Reluctantly, Thomas obeyed, Clara trembling at his side. But as they walked, he couldn't shake the truth clawing its way into his mind. The mine wasn't abandoned, and something in Dustwood wanted it to stay buried. The sheriff marched them back toward town, his lantern swinging in sharp arcs that carved brief slices of light through the trees. The rifle stayed leveled on Thomas's back the entire walk, a constant reminder that curiosity had a price in Dustwood. When they reached the sheriff's office, he shoved them inside, slammed the door, and dropped the rifle against the desk with a thud. "You don't listen, Hale," Latham said, his jaw tight. "You keep poking around and you'll end up just like the rest. Missing. Or worse." Clara bristled. "You think threatening us will make us forget what we heard? My brother is in there." "Your brother is dead," the sheriff snapped, louder than he intended. His hand trembled against the lantern. "And the more you go digging, the sooner you'll join him. Do you understand me?" The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the creak of the wooden floor as Latham shifted his weight. Thomas studied the man. His words were harsh, but his eyes betrayed something else. Fear, yes, but also guilt. Before Thomas could press, the sheriff shoved open the door. "Go home. Both of you. And if I see either of you near that mine again, I won't bother with a warning." He herded them into the street, then barred the door behind them. The town was quiet, but not the natural quiet of sleep. It was the kind that clung like smoke, a silence too heavy as though the whole town held its breath. Clara pulled Thomas aside, whispering fiercely. "He knows something. He's hiding it." "I know," Thomas said, scanning the dark street. "But he's not the only one watching us." Clara frowned. "What do you mean?" Thomas tilted his head. At the far end of the street, barely touched by moonlight, two figures stood, unmoving, cloaked in long coats and wide hats that shadowed their faces. They didn't step forward. They didn't speak. They only watched. Clara stiffened. "Have they been there since?" "Yes," Thomas said. "Since the mine." The figures shifted slightly as if in response, but made no move closer. Thomas's reporter instinct screamed. He'd seen intimidation before, but this was something colder. Organized. Deliberate. These weren't just men guarding a secret. They were part of it. One of the figures raised a gloved hand, pointing directly at Thomas, then at Clara. Then, without a word, they melted into the darkness between the buildings, gone as if they'd never been there. Clara clutched Thomas's arm. Who are they? Thomas's mind worked fast. The sheriff's fear. The town's silence. The figures in the night. It was all connected, a web he'd only begun to touch. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But if Dustwood is hiding something in that mine, those men are making sure it never comes out." Clara shivered, her eyes flicking to the shadows where the watchers had stood. "Then we'd better find the truth before they find us." Thomas didn't sleep that night. He sat at his desk in the boarding house, the oil lamp burning low, his notes scattered before him. His pencil tapped against the edge of the paper as if rhythm could coax clarity. But the only thing he could see when he closed his eyes were those faceless men standing in the street, watching, waiting. By dawn, he had one conclusion. Whatever haunted Dustwood wasn't just folklore. The mine, the sheriff, the watchers, all of it pointed to something bigger. Something buried. Clara appeared at his door, pale but determined. She carried a leather-bound book clutched to her chest. "I went through Elias's things," she said. "I found this." She set the book on the desk. A journal, worn at the edges, the leather cracked from use. The first pages were filled with Elias's neat handwriting. Observations from the mine, notes on or samples, strange noises he'd heard. But then, halfway through, the entries stopped abruptly. The next dozen pages had been torn out, leaving only ragged stubs of paper. "Someone didn't want us reading the rest," Thomas said, running his fingers over the torn edges. Clara nodded, her jaw tight. "He mentioned hearing voices. Said they sounded like they came from inside the stone itself. But he also wrote." She hesitated, flipping to the last complete entry. Thomas read aloud. "The mine breathes. It isn't rock. It isn't earth. Feels alive. And if I keep listening, I'm afraid it will know me." The words sent a chill through him. Clara looked away, whispering, "That was the last thing he wrote." Thomas leaned back, piecing it together. The missing pages weren't random. They were deliberate. Someone had ripped out the part where Elias must have discovered too much. He closed the book gently. "We need to find those pages. They're the key." Clara crossed her arms. "And where do you suggest we start? The sheriff? Those men?" Thomas's gaze drifted to the window, where the early morning light fell across the quiet street. If someone wanted them hidden, they wouldn't destroy them. They'd keep them close. The question is, who in this town has the most to lose if the truth gets out? Before Clara could answer, a sound broke the silence. A soft thump against the door. Thomas stood, opened it cautiously, and froze. On the porch lay an envelope, plain and unmarked. No footsteps in the dust. No figure in sight. Just the envelope, resting like a warning. He picked it up, tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper. A fragment, handwriting scrawled in haste, familiar to Clara. "Elias's." Thomas read aloud. "They told me not to write this. They said the town's future depends on silence. But the mine isn't what it seems. It's older, it's waiting. And it will not stay sleeping." The rest of the page ended abruptly, a jagged tear running down the center. Clara's hand shook. "Someone wants us to know just enough. But not everything." Thomas folded the page carefully, tucking it into the journal. His voice was low, steady. "Then it's time we stop waiting for scraps. We go back into that mine." Clara's eyes widened. "At night? With those men watching?" Thomas looked out into the waking town, where shutters creaked open and wary eyes peeked through. He felt the weight of the secret pressing in. "Yes," he said. "Because if we don't, Dustwood will bury the truth, and us with it." The mine loomed like a gaping wound on the edge of Dustwood, its wooden frame rotting, its warning signs faded to whispers. Thomas and Clara stood before it at dusk, their lanterns dimmed, their breaths sharp in the cooling air. Clara gripped her coat tighter. "You really think the answers are in there?" Thomas glanced back toward the town. The silhouettes of the faceless men lingered near the road, always watching, never moving closer. "If Elias wrote the mine was alive," he said, "then whatever killed him is inside. And the missing pages, whoever's leaving them, wants us to see." They stepped into the yawning darkness. The air shifted instantly, cold, damp, metallic, thick with the weight of silence. Their lanterns cast long shadows against the walls, jagged veins of rock glinting faintly. The deeper they went, the more the mine seemed to breathe. A faint sound echoed. Not the drip of water, not the creak of wood, but something that hummed low in the stone itself, like a heartbeat muffled by earth. Clara froze. "Do you hear that?" Thomas nodded, jaw clenched. "Keep moving." They followed the path down until the wooden supports ended, opening into a cavern Elias had described in his notes. The walls pulsed with veins of something strange, or that wasn't quite, or glowing faintly in the lantern light. Thomas crouched, running his fingers across the surface. The rock was warm. Too warm. Suddenly Clara gasped. On the ground near the wall lay scraps of paper, dirt-stained and torn, the missing pages. Thomas snatched them up, scanning the frantic handwriting. "The mine isn't hollow. It's a mouth. The stone listens. Remembers. The men don't just work here, they feed it." The last line was smeared as though written in haste or blood. Before Thomas could read more, a sound tore through the cavern, heavy boots, crunching gravel. Lantern light flickered in the tunnel behind them. Voices. Clara's face went pale. "They followed us." Thomas stuffed the pages into his coat. He extinguished his lantern, plunging them into darkness. The mine's strange glow was faint but enough to navigate. He grabbed Clara's hand. "Quiet," he whispered. "We're not alone." From the cavern's far wall came a sound that wasn't human, low, deep, like stone grinding against stone, but threaded with a whisper. The mine spoke, and the voices of the men in the tunnel grew louder, closing in. The voices of the men echoed closer, lanterns swaying like fireflies in the tunnel's throat. Thomas pressed Clara against the cavern wall, his heart hammering as he held his breath. The strange glow pulsing from the rock intensified, as if reacting to their fear. Then it came, the whisper. Not words, not quite, but a vibration that crawled along their bones and sank into their minds. Clara shivered. "It's speaking to me." Thomas tightened his grip on her arm. "Don't listen. That's what Elias warned about." The faceless men entered the cavern. Their movements were stiff, deliberate. Each carried a lantern, but their faces were lost in shadow, blurred as though painted over. They didn't search blindly, they walked with purpose as if drawn to the stone itself. One of them reached out and pressed a hand to the glowing wall. Immediately the cavern hummed louder. The whisper sharpened into fragmented words. "They remember? Stay." Clara clapped her hands over her ears, trembling. "It knows our names." Thomas dragged her deeper into the cavern, toward a fissure half hidden by rubble. They squeezed inside, the stone scraping their shoulders. On the other side was a narrow shaft that dropped further into the mine's belly. Clara's lantern flickered. "If we go down, we might not come back." "If we stay," Thomas whispered, "we won't have a choice." Behind them, the faceless men began to chant in low, guttural tones, words Thomas couldn't place but felt in his chest. The mine seemed to answer, the glow rippling like a heartbeat, the whispers growing into a chorus. Thomas shoved the last scrap of Elias's notes into Clara's hands. "Read." She squinted at the faded ink. "The mine remembers what was buried in it. Every life it takes becomes its voice. The men are not men anymore." Thomas's stomach tightened. "That's why their faces." The chanting stopped. Silence rushed in, heavy and suffocating. Then, in one single breath, the voices of the faceless men and the whispers of the mine spoke together. "You should not have come." The stone cracked beneath their feet. Dust fell like ash. Clara screamed as the shaft yawned wider, threatening to swallow them whole. Thomas grabbed her arm. "Jump or die." And together, they leapt into the abyss below, vanishing into the mine's darkest depths. The fall was not endless. Thomas and Clara landed hard on damp earth, pain shooting up their legs. The shaft above sealed itself with a thunderous groan, leaving them in choking blackness. Only Clara's battered lantern flickered weakly, casting a trembling glow across the chamber. The air here was heavier, thicker, as if every breath pulled in centuries of sorrow. Strange carvings lined the cavern walls, symbols not of miners but of something older. Circles, spirals, jagged strokes that seemed to move when looked at too long. Clara's voice broke the silence. This isn't the mine anymore. It's something else, older than Dustwood. Thomas raised the lantern higher and his gut clenched. In the center of the chamber lay a pit. From it rose a faint mist, glowing faintly blue, and within that mist faces swirled, hundreds of them. Men, women, children. Their mouths open in silent screams. "The missing people," Thomas whispered. The mist swirled faster at the sound of his voice. The whispers returned, louder now, almost frantic. "Stay, join, remember." Clara stumbled backward, but her eyes locked on one face in the mist. Tears welled. "That's Thomas, that's my brother." Thomas grabbed her wrist before she could move closer. "That's not him, Clara. That's the mine using him." Her voice cracked. "But he's calling me." The mist reached toward her, tendrils curling like fingers. For a terrifying moment, it looked as if the pit itself wanted to pull her in. Thomas yanked her back. From the shadows, a figure stepped forward. Not faceless this time. An old man, his skin pale as chalk, his eyes hollow yet burning with recognition. His voice rasped, every word dragged across stone. "You don't understand. The mine feeds Dustwood. Always has. Without its hunger, this town would wither to dust." Thomas froze. "Who are you?" The man smiled, cracked and ghastly. "I was the first keeper of its secret. I gave it my family, my blood. And in return the town survived the depression, the droughts, every storm. Dustwood owes its life to what's buried here." Clara shook her head in horror. "You're saying they sacrificed people?" The man's grin widened. "Not sacrificed. Offered. Every soul became part of the mine's memory. And soon so will you." The pit surged, the mist rising higher, curling around the chamber like a living storm. Thomas pulled Clara behind him. "Not if I burn this whole place down." The man's laugh echoed like breaking stone. "You cannot burn memory. You cannot kill hunger. You can only feed it or become it." The whispers grew into a roar. The faces pressed against the mist, mouths stretching wide. Clara clutched Thomas's arm, her face pale. "What do we do?" Thomas stared at the swirling pit, the countless faces trapped within, the truth of Dustwood laid bare. His throat tightened but his voice was steady. "We find a way to end it, even if the town dies with it." The mist surged forward. The chamber shook. The battle for Dustwood had begun. The cavern shuddered as if the earth itself objected to Thomas's words. Dust rained from the ceiling, and the pit's mist lashed out in violent waves. The old man, the keeper, stood unflinching, arms spread wide like a priest before an altar. "You speak of ending it," he croaked, "but Dustwood is nothing without the mine." The townsfolk knew this once. They gave willingly, believing it kept their children safe. You call it horror, yet you drink its bread, breathe its air, live in its protection. Thomas tightened his jaw, holding Clara close. Protection built on murder isn't protection. It's chains. The keeper's pale eyes locked on him, searching, almost amused. "Then why do you stay, journalist? You could have left, written your stories, let the town rot. Yet you dig deeper. Perhaps you belong here." The mist stirred at his words, swirling around Thomas, brushing against his skin like cold breath. For an instant he swore he heard his father's voice in the whispers. Stern, disappointed, the same voice that haunted him since he fled home years ago. "Thomas," it hissed. "You never finish anything. Always running. Stay this time. Stay." Clara grabbed his arm. "Don't listen. That's not real." Thomas blinked hard, breaking the pull. He turned on the keeper, anger flaring. "You think feeding this thing is the only way? You're wrong. It's fear keeping Dustwood alive, not sacrifice." The keeper tilted his head, almost pitying. "And if I told you there was another way? A bargain yet unbroken?" The chamber fell still. Even the mist paused, recoiling slightly as if wary of what the man would say. Clara frowned. "What bargain?" The keeper's grin returned, sharp as broken glass. "One may choose to bear the burden alone. to bind the mind's hunger to themselves. The faces, the whispers, the torment, all devoured by a single soul. The town would remain free, as long as that soul endured. Thomas's stomach turned. You're talking about possession. Becoming its prisoner. Not prisoner, the keeper rasped. Guardian. For generations there has always been one. Until I grew tired and let the town fend for itself. That is why the hunger spread wild, why it took so many. Without a keeper, the mind becomes chaos. Clara's grip on Thomas tightened, her voice trembling. He wants you to replace him. The keeper stepped closer, his withered hands shaking yet deliberate. Take the burden, journalist, or watch Dustwood collapse into the pit. There is no third path. The lantern flickered, the chamber shadows dancing wildly. Thomas looked at Clara. At her brother's face still flickering in the mist. At the weight of truth pressing down heavier than the earth above. His chest ached with the choice, each option a blade. Finally he spoke, his voice low. If there's really no third path, then I'll make one. The keeper's grin faltered for the first time. Clara's eyes widened. Thomas, what are you thinking? He stared at the pit, his jaw set. Not to feed it. Not to guard it. To end it. The keeper's scream tore through the cavern, a sound both human and inhuman. The mist surged in fury. And Dustwood trembled as though the very ground was preparing for war. The mine roared like a waking beast. The lantern in Thomas's hand flared and then burst, plunging them into the crimson glow of the pit. Shadows clawed up the walls and the mist thickened, alive with rage. The keeper staggered, clutching his chest as if Thomas's words had wounded him. You fool, he spat, his voice breaking into a rasp. The mine cannot be ended. It is Dustwood. Tear it apart and you'll tear the town with it. Thomas stood firm, heart pounding so hard he thought it might break his ribs. Then let it burn. Better ashes than chains. Clara gasped, her face pale. Thomas, if the town falls, everyone, my family? He turned to her, his eyes raw but steady. Clara, how many more brothers will it take before someone says enough? For a moment she said nothing. Then with a trembling breath she nodded. The pit answered before the keeper could. The mist lunged, striking at Thomas like spears of smoke. He threw himself to the ground, pulling Clara with him. The air burned his lungs, heavy with the stench of sulfur. The keeper raised his arms, chanting words that shook the rock. Veins of glowing red split across the cavern floor, molten light spilling upward. The mine itself was waking, veins like fire feeding into the pit. Clara pointed toward a collapsed tunnel. Dynamite, they left some crates during the last blast. If we can reach them. Thomas's eyes snapped toward it. His throat he shouted, shoving her toward the tunnel. But she clung to his arm. Not without you. The keeper's scream split the cavern, a howl that rattled stone from the ceiling. He lunged, the mist pouring through him like a storm, his arms stretching into clawed shadows. The dynamite hissed louder, seconds from fury. Thomas yanked Clara close. "Run, Clara. Tell them the truth. That's all I ask." She shook her head wildly, sobbing. "We'll do it together." The ground split beneath them. Fire surged from the veins, licking up the walls, swallowing the wooden beams. The air thickened with choking smoke and sulfur. Thomas shoved her hard, sending her stumbling into the tunnel. She screamed his name, but the roar of the mine swallowed it whole. The keeper lunged. Thomas met him head-on, grabbing the bundle of dynamite and hurling himself toward the pit. Their bodies collided, and for a moment the world froze. Man and monster locked in one final embrace. Then the blast came. White fire tore through the cavern, a blinding fury that devoured everything. The ground shook as if the earth itself cried out. The mine screamed, a sound not of collapsing stone but of something ancient dying at last. Clara barely made it through the tunnel. The explosion hurled her into the dirt outside. She hit the ground hard, coughing blood, her ears ringing with silence. Behind her, the mine belched fire, its entrance collapsing in on itself. A tower of black smoke clawed into the sky. The people of Dustwood, roused by the blast, stumbled into the streets. They stood staring at the column of smoke rising from the hills, fear and awe etched into their faces. "Thomas," Clara whispered, dragging herself to her knees. Her hands trembled, clutching the dirt as if it would anchor her grief. Behind her, the last echoes of the mine groaned and fell still. Dustwood's curse was broken. But Thomas was gone. Weeks passed. The hills of Dustwood still bore the scar where the mine once breathed fire and smoke. Now it was nothing but rubble, a blackened wound covered with ash. The town lived quieter, almost reverent, like a place that had seen death up close and was still deciding how to live again. Clara stayed. She could have left, gone back to the city with her notebook full of truths and a story that would make her name shine in papers across the country. But she remained in Dustwood because every sunrise she half expected to see Thomas walking down the dirt road, grinning with soot on his cheek, asking her for another cigarette he never smoked. She wrote. Oh, she wrote like her life depended on it. Articles about corruption, about the families who had been silenced, about the men and women swallowed by the mine. She named them all. She gave them back their voices. And at the center of it all, she wrote about Thomas Hale, the man who had carried Dustwood's curse into the dark and never returned. The townsfolk read her words in silence. Some wept, some cursed, but none denied the truth anymore. For the first time in decades, Dustwood looked itself in the mirror and did not turn away. One evening, Clara climbed the hill where the mine once stood. The wind carried the smell of iron and ash. She set down a lantern, its glow soft against the stones. "This is for you," she whispered. "You gave me a story, Thomas. But more than that, you gave me courage." She stayed until the flame burned low. The shadows crept long across the ruins, curling like smoke, but this time they did not frighten her. They were only shadows. Nothing more. As the lantern finally sputtered out, Clara rose, brushing dirt from her skirt. She looked once more at the grave of Dustwood's curse, then walked back down the hill. The past had burned. The truth had been told. And though grief would always follow her, Clara carried Thomas's last words like a vow. Tell them the truth. So she did. This is the end of the story. I hope you enjoy it. Subscribe for more story like this.